You're listening to The Dirt on the Past, a show on history and archaeology and why it matters today. You can find us on the Extreme History Project website and also on kgbm.org. Thanks for listening. Welcome to The Dirt on the Past from the Extreme History Project and KGBM Community Radio.
Whether digging up a site or dusting off the archives, we bring you some of the most fascinating and cutting-edge research in history and archaeology and discuss why it matters today. Join me, Nancy Mahoney, alongside co-host Crystal Alegria, as we converse with anthropologists, archaeologists,
and historians about how they bring the past alive.
Welcome to this week's edition of the show. I'm Nancy.
And I'm Crystal.
And we are the co-hosts of The Dirt on the Past, the podcast that delves into lesser-known histories and explores their relevance to modern issues. This week, it's Crystal and I, and we're at the Extreme History headquarters, and we're going to give you some new information about the podcast. We're going to talk a little about Women's History Month, which is March, and update you on other aspects of the Extreme History Project.
Yes, so Nancy, I have to tell you that to date we have recorded 20 episodes.
I was wondering how many there were. Wow, that's a lot more than I thought. So this is since August or September.
Yep. So today's the 21st episode. So we've gotten a lot under our belt in the last few months. So
we have talked to a lot of very interesting people. That is true.
We have. And I myself, and I think you as well, have really enjoyed doing this podcast and have really enjoyed talking to all the people we've talked to and learning about all the things, the new topics and new subjects that we've delved into in order to talk to all these different people.
I know. I sort of feel like we're jumping on the podcast bandwagon, which everyone else is doing too. But this has been really fun. And for me, part of it is having a co-host with you and then selecting all these people we've always wanted to talk to or talk to in more depth about their research. So it has been such a phenomenal experience also having Steve who's able to edit for us. So we don't have to leave in all those horrible bloopers and we don't have to re-listen to ourselves either in order to edit. So that has been huge. But it's been really fun, and knowing that your son did the music, your son Lawson, our intro music has been really great. And we've had that since the beginning of the show, which has been fun. Yeah.
Lawson is an aspiring musician and he just he plays the piano, he plays the stand-up bass, he plays the drums.
He's a one-man band.
But the piano is his thing. So
amazing.
Yeah. So maybe he'll do some more music for us eventually. We'll have to switch out the front, the lead-in song.
We might want something a little moodier or maybe something for our cemetery edition of the podcast that hopefully will be coming out maybe this summer.
So watch for that. Yeah, we're excited to talk more about. We really have a love for cemeteries.
Absolutely,
cemeteries for us are outdoor archives, and so we enjoy doing a lot of work in cemeteries and have done. So we thought we would bring that into the podcast as well.
Right. So there'll be a separate podcast edition that focuses in on cemeteries. So Crystal and I have already talked a bit about death and cemeteries and different mortuary customs and talked to other people who like hanging out in cemeteries too. But so for those of you who love that aspect of what we talk about, there'll be a little bit more of a specific podcast focused on that. So,
But Nancy, we have some really big news today. So
we do.
What is it?
We do. Our big news, which we are very excited about, is that we finally have our own logo for this podcast. We have been under the umbrella of the Extreme History Project, which has been wonderful, but we are the Dirt on the Past. We have our own name. People want to find us, and we decided that we needed to work with a professional to help us get something out there that represented us.
Yeah.
So we were fortunate enough to work with Maida Newhouse right here in Montana. She is a professor right now at MSU. but has also had her own long career out in the real world as a professional who has created logos for people. So this was an interesting experience for us, right?
Yeah, it really was. And so The Dirt on the Past is a podcast of the Extreme History Project, but we really did want to have a little bit of a different look for this podcast so that people could find it. Because we were using the Extreme History logo, which was the Extreme History Project. So it was, kind of hard for people to search out The Dirt on the Past.
Right. And this is starting to have maybe its own audience even in some ways because it reaches people in a different way. We know we've been getting some people listening from Brazil, from Norway, from other countries, and maybe because of specific topics at different times. So that's been fun. So we tasked Maida with coming up with a image for us for our podcast, and we filled out a questionnaire, but what we did not do was actually go look at other podcast logos.
And, I don't think I really thought about, when we went into that, I had no idea what I wanted it to look like either, so we kind of went in blind. But
we went in blind, which was really silly because you never go and sort of buy or shop for anything or design anything without first seeing all what's out there, right? And we listen to podcasts all the time. You do, I do. Mm-hmm. And we finally realized after our first round that Maida was trying to figure out what we wanted and that we had better go do some looking around, which we did.
And think more deeply about. What we wanted this podcast to be, too. And I think that was a part of it. Since we had started the podcast, we kind of hit the ground running, as we do with everything, I guess we do in our lives. And I don't think we had really thought through the end, where we wanted to go with this podcast in the end. And so that was interesting to kind of think through that, kind of our long-term goals for this podcast.
Our long-term goals for this, right? Yeah. How it started and where it's going and who our audience is. And we started looking and we found some images that really spoke to us. So we hope when you take a look at it that you like it and it speaks to you too. We have something that looks like the sun setting over a very stylized version of Stonehenge, but then the shadow from Stonehenge is not just a reflection of those big monoliths. The shadow is actually the shadow of a more historic cityscape. And the idea is that we have prehistoric past, historic past, bringing those things together in a way that makes you look at it from a different perspective, perhaps, and brings you into a history that you didn't know.
Right.
That's what I see in it.
Yeah. And it kind of speaks to that idea of place. And I think Nancy and I both, you and I, Nancy, we both are so grounded in the history, the archaeology of place, that I think that really spoke to us because place means so much to us. And all the work we do is really around people, but people in these places and these landscapes that really shape the lives of those people.
Yeah, and how they become meaningful places to people, how places come to have a name, how they come to be marked, and then how they come to be these historically important and significant places that tell us about our identity and who we are as people. So that, I think, is some of what we were hoping to convey, and we were just thrilled with the way it came out. Mm-hmm. So now you can find us more easily as just The Dirt on the Past. It still says an Extreme History Podcast on there, so we will always be a part of that. And as we spin off a Cemetery Edition, you'll see another logo for that too.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
That'll be exciting.
Right.
So speaking of Extreme History as the mothership, we just had our annual board meeting for Extreme History, and it's always exciting because we get to revisit what things have happened over the past year and what the plans are for the next year. So Crystal, you always put this together, and there's an aspect of going over the financials and the health of the organization, but it has been such a big and strange year with the pandemic starting, and there has had to have been a lot of modifications and changes. So I wondered if you could take us through some of the things that happened or didn't happen, and let's start with one of the aspects of Extreme History that so many people know if they live in Bozeman, is that Extreme History does walking tours throughout the downtown area, throughout the cemetery and other places. And we had big ideas of expanding the types of walking tours we were doing, the topics, ones that had to do with breweries and distilleries and all sorts of other wonderful things. So with the pandemic, that possibility sort of went away. So what happened for Extreme History with walking tours?
Yeah, well, Extreme History, most of the things we do are front facing. So everything we do is with the public. And so when the pandemic hit, that was tough for us because we had to kind of reconfigure just about everything we did, but especially the walking tours. And so what we did with those is we started doing walking tours last year in May with just groups of 10 people. Everyone had to wear a mask, and we'd make sure that people were spread out during those tours. But I got kind of uncomfortable with that because we had, of course, during the pandemic, we're here in Bozeman, Montana, which is a smaller town, and people from all over the country were wanting to travel, and they felt the safest place to come was Bozeman, Montana. Or one of the safer places to come was here.
It seems like the country was converging here. Yes,
we had
exactly.
So many people come into town looking for, something to do, an escape from the city.
To be outside.
To go to our Yellowstone National Park, to our state parks. And so we had a lot of interest in the walking tours, but I got a little nervous when we'd be on a tour and there'd be, someone from Georgia and someone from Florida and someone from New York and then a few Bozeman people, in there, and everyone had just gotten off a plane coming in.
Right.
And then halfway through, people were starting to take their masks off, and it just got a little worrisome for me. So we actually, and the numbers here in Bozeman, the COVID numbers were getting pretty high about that time.
They started to rise.
So I got nervous, and so we shut down the walking tours for most of the rest of the summer. We started doing cemetery tours towards the end again because the cemetery is a place where we can really spread out, and I felt more like that was a safer place to do tours.
And there isn't the noise of the street and traffic, so people can be a little bit more distant, socially distant, and still hear you. So that was probably a little bit easier.
Right. So we started doing some more cemetery tours at the end of the summer season last year, and that worked well. But we really didn't have a walking tour season last year, so I really missed it. I know, I really missed it. And all our walking tour guides, we didn't have them do tours. So it was just myself and Cheryl Hendry, who works with us, and then Jessica Jones. So it was just the three of us doing tours.
Just a small crew.
Yeah.
And what do you think about this coming late spring and summer? What do you think will happen?
I think we're going to go forward with tours. We'll probably start similar to last year with 10 groups of 10, but we'll just kind of see how it goes. I mean, it's coming right up. We're in March right now, and so we usually start walking tours in May. So we are, kind of moving forward as we usually do with our walking tour season. We're starting to figure out what tours we want to do. We're seeing what walking tour guides are interested in doing the tours right now, and then kind of figuring out what that's going to look like. So, but I feel like it's going to be a more normal, it might not be a completely normal walking tour season, but it'll definitely be more normal.
Well, more and more people are getting vaccinated every day, and we know more about the different strains, and people are used to wearing masks. So hopefully also, given what they're predicting, that most people might have a vaccine or at least enough to reach herd immunity by summer. So hopefully that means your walking tours can be up and running again. That'll be exciting. Yeah.
We sure miss doing them. And we really feel they're an important way to get history to the public, in a really visual way, where when you're on the street looking at a building and you're seeing the building, you're feeling what the streetscape is like, you're hearing the train whistle in the background, it's just this.
Your imagination really could make it, along the creek as well. That runs right through town, and knowing that, the Chinese immigrants that lived here were growing crops along there and selling them to people in Bozeman, all of that'll be amazing. Yeah. Well, I hope that is successful. And let's talk a little bit about the lecture series too, because that was planned to go on all of last summer and fall, and you had to make some changes with that as well.
Right. So we went virtual. We are doing all our lectures on Zoom now, and that actually works really well.
How many people attend when you have a Zoom lecture? Because when we normally do the lecture series, it's in the Museum of the Rockies is it the Hayden?
Hager Auditorium.
Hager Auditorium. And how many does that hold?
It holds 200.
Okay.
And so on Zoom, we have the membership level where we can have 100 people on at a time.
Wow.
So all of our lectures, the last few lectures, we've had about 150 people register, and then only 100 can get in. So the first 100 get in. But
wow.
We then also record the Zoom lectures, and we have those on our YouTube page so people can go back and watch them later. And we do get a lot of watches after the fact.
That's wonderful.
So,
and being able to do that through Zoom and knowing so many people, people have become comfortable with getting their content that way.
Yeah.
And do you do a question and answer session at the end on Zoom the way you've been doing it in person?
Yep, we do that. So the presenter usually does their presentation, and then we have about 20 minutes of question and answer. So the last lecture we did was pretty amazing. A woman whose name is Laura Arata has recently written a book on Sarah Bigford. And Sarah was a African-American woman who lived in Montana, in Virginia City, Montana, in the 1860s through the 1930s. She died in 1930. Something. And so Laura had written a book about her, and this woman lived a pretty extraordinary life because, of course, she was born enslaved, grew up enslaved, made her way to Montana as a single young woman, and then married a couple different men. She married one man who was a white man. He was abusive to her, so she divorced him, married another man, and kind of lived her life the rest of her whole life in Virginia City.
She stayed there.
She stayed there.
Wow.
And she actually operated, her second husband owned a water utility company. So when he died, she took that over.
She took over the business.
And so she was
allowed to do that.
owner.
That's an amazing story. Is she buried in the Sunset Hills Cemetery?
She's buried in the...
not Sunset Hills,
yeah,
sorry.
She's buried in the... I'm going to forget the name of the cemetery in Virginia City, but Hillside Cemetery.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So she's there.
Under a fairly large headstone. So
wow. Nice.
So Sarah Bigford, so that was a really popular lecture, and it was wonderful because some of the descendants of Sarah Bigford were on the Zoom presentation. And so at the end, they were talking, saying, hi, I'm so-and-so, and I'm a descendant. I'm the great-great-granddaughter of Sarah Bigford.
Fantastic.
So it was wonderful to have them on the Zoom call or the Zoom presentation as well.
And again, this idea that local history is national history is bigger, with just this idea that born into slavery from the Civil War, people are ending up in Montana, and they had very different lives when they got here. And she clearly had some hardships, but was able to make a life for herself, a successful life for herself. She must have been a very strong woman. So will you continue doing Zoom lectures?
I don't know. That's the question. We have a lot of people who email and say they love the Zoom lectures and that they're more accessible and easier to access. And so I don't know. I feel going forward, we might do both. We might do it as an in-person, but then we might also have the Zoom option.
Okay. So the best of both worlds, hopefully.
Yeah.
I do like going and seeing a lecture in person, but there are times where you just can't, or there's times where we know we've had to turn people away when they've come because there hasn't been enough room to get in. So this seems like a wonderful option to be able to keep doing it. So there's some upsides, right?
There's some upsides.
Things that you've learned how to do differently and to still reach an audience. Okay.
Yeah. And one of the upsides, I think, of COVID was that we had to kind of reconfigure how we do everything. And that made us really move forward into some things that we were thinking about doing, but just hadn't got there yet. And this podcast is one of those things. We had always thought about a podcast and talked about a podcast. And then when COVID happened, we thought, well, now's, let's do it. Now's the time.
Let's do it. There's other things that aren't happening, and let's jump in there with a new plan. Yeah. I mean, I can't tell you how many things I learned how to fix around my house just because for a while I had more time. It does feel we are getting back to busier lives again. Yeah. But it's nice then that the podcast, the Zoom lectures, these things will keep going, which is wonderful. So also some other things that you all started at Extreme History during the shutdown and the pandemic. One is a book club. So tell us a little bit about that. Oh, and before we turn to the book club, I just wanted to ask you who the next person is in the lecture series.
Right. So the next person is in April. Okay. Carrie Clement, Carrie was one of our podcast interviewees.
I remember, right.
About a month ago or so. But she is going to talk about what is a country without horses, Robert Yellowtail and horse herd restoration on the Crow Reservation from 1934 to 1944. So that is our lecture, and that is on April 22nd at 6 p.m. So if you want to interact with that, if you want to attend that, just go to the Extreme History Project website, go to our lecture series tab, and you'll find the link to click on to register for that Zoom presentation. And then you might want to click on about 10 minutes before or something to be able to get in. Because like I said, we've been having a lot of people attend those. And so if you want to attend it live.
And that's going to be a popular topic, I think, as well. And she's done a lot of research on that, Carrie has. So that'll be a wonderful lecture, I'm sure. Okay, so let's talk about the book club then, which I think you guys have a winning model of pairing books and wine, even though it's virtual. So tell us a little bit about that and how it got started.
Right. Well, our coworker Cheryl Hendry, Cheryl and I were talking after COVID hit, we were kind of figuring out how to redo some of the things or get to our audience in a new way. And Cheryl suggested that we do a book club. And we were also concerned at that point, this was in probably March of last year, about a year ago. And we were also concerned about our downtown businesses because, of course, they were all shut down. We were worried about the sustainability of them being shut down through this time. And so we wanted to do something to partner with them to help them during this crisis. And so Cheryl suggested that we do a book club where we buy the books from our local bookstore, Country Bookshelf.
Country Bookshelf, wonderful.
Yeah. And then we buy wine from our local wine shop, which is called Blend here in Bozeman.
Which Cheryl knows very well. And subsequently I have gotten to know very well also. They're fantastic. Yeah.
We support them a lot.
We do. We are of both the bookshelf, Country Bookshelf, and Blend, and definitely Blend. Yes.
Yeah. So we formulated this plan to have a book club once a month where we'd get the book from Country Bookshelf, the wine from Blend, and then people would pay us, for both of those things.
They would Venmo
us some cash.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And so we tried it, and it worked. People love it, and so we're still going strong. And
but you've left out one important perk. So how do people get their book and their wine?
Oh, yes. So Cheryl drops it off, and so it's kind of a local thing. Because Cheryl can only drive so far. So Cheryl gathers up the books and the wine, and she does a little delivery system. She has a whole delivery system for everybody, and she drives throughout town. But we have people who are in Helena who have been.
Yes, you were driving some wine up to Helena, I believe, just the other day.
Which is okay. I can do that. And we have a book club participant in Gardner. So we get to take turns going, driving to Gardner every other month, which isn't a bad thing.
Right. So, no, I think it's wonderful though. And it adds that real special personal touch, especially when everyone was feeling so disconnected. Yeah. I think people were more than willing to join and pay and then even donate a bit extra to the organization,
which is wonderful.
Which is so wonderful.
And then we meet on Zoom.
Right.
And so
you actually do a discussion with everybody. So you have to limit the number then for that to work.
So we limit it to about 10 to 15 people. And that seems like a good size. And sometimes we'll have more than 10 or 15 people sign up. So we will do 2 sessions which Cheryl and I both moderate. And last year we had one of our interns help us moderate as well, Maggie.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so that was great.
That is so great. And that, again, is something I'm wondering, would you switch to an in-person book club, or will you continue to do it on Zoom?
Well, we've been talking about that too, and we've been talking about that at book club with the book club participants to see what they would like to do. And right now we'll just keep it on Zoom, but maybe eventually we'll do it here in the Extreme History headquarters. We have kind of an open area, a little living room space.
Lovely little living room space. Yeah, I could see both going parallel to each other. That would be really nice.
But we'd still have to keep the wine. We couldn't let that go.
Absolutely. We have to make sure Blend is in on this the whole way through. Yeah. That's great.
So it's been a great thing. And the National Council for Social Studies, I think it was actually the National Council for Public History, just did a blog about the importance of book clubs and getting history out to the public and how that really does the job. And we've really seen that with our book club. People have been so much more engaged in history. These people have really engaged with these books and the historical aspects of these books. And
the more you read them and engage with people, the more knowledge you have to build on. Did you have a theme in particular with the book club?
Well, we did have a theme starting out. We did memoirs last year in 2020. And then our theme for this year is Native American activists and their memoirs and their books that they've written. So this month in March, we're reading Sarah Winnemucca by Sally, I'm going to butcher this last name, but Zanjani.
Okay. And we'll accept that.
Okay. Good.
And apologies if we got it wrong.
Yes. But so that's what we're reading this month. Next month, we're going to read As Long as the Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. And so that's, we have books kind of along those lines
and
set up for this year.
Last month was a fiction novel, is that right? But based on, the idea of a true personal story. It was Louise Erdrich's book, or I don't know how to say her last name either.
I think you said that right.
Was it The Night Watchman?
The Night Watchman, yeah. And that was a wonderful book. And people in the book club just loved it, as did I. But it was a good book about termination, Native American reservation termination very late in the 1950s.
So late for that to still be happening. Mm-hmm. That's what I find so interesting. Sometimes historical fiction can teach you so much in a way that doesn't feel like you're being lectured at. And it's a wonderful way to keep those conversations going and make them really relevant. You are listening to The Dirt on the Past with co-hosts Crystal Alegria and Nancy Mahoney on KGVM Bozeman, or wherever you find your podcasts. Today, it's just Crystal and I speaking about the Extreme History Project and the podcast series, The Dirt on the Past. You also have plans for in the actual physical building that Extreme History is in, which we'll talk about more in a minute, but you have a room that you've set aside where you're thinking of opening a bookstore.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah, so we're in this wonderful historical building in downtown Bozeman, Montana, and we have a room that would be perfect for a bookshop. And so during this COVID time, we kind of moved things around in this building and started building the bookshop. So it's in process right now. We hope it will be opening as summer comes upon us and people can come in, and hopefully we'll feel safe enough where people can come in and shop, and it's going to be used in new books that focus on history, archaeology, Native American studies, all those humanities, historical fiction, so history adjacent, so
nice.
All those kinds of titles.
It'll be lovely for people waiting for walking tours to have that space to browse, or just a quiet room where you can actually even look through these things to see which ones you might want to buy. Well, that's so exciting for Extreme History, being able to expand that way, meet ever more the curiosities of the people who live here and also the people who visit us. So let's turn a little bit to the fact that it is Women's History Month right now, and we are in a building that was built for women to live in. So we know that this building was used historically as a brothel, as a home, one of the nicer ones, where men would be able to come and visit, where they could get drinks and that they could meet women and pay for services. So tell me a little bit about what you've learned about this building since you've moved the headquarters in here. What is it now? Is it
almost 2 years?
Almost 2 years.
Yeah.
That's
so
amazing.
We've been in this building in the historic part of Bozeman for almost 2 years. And like you said, Nancy, it was built in 1891, and it was built specifically to be a brothel. So that's what it was built for. And about that time in our country's history and our state's history, Montana had just become a state in 1889.
So this is just after.
Yeah, this is just after we became a state. And the state was looking for a new place to have the capital. And Bozeman was in the running for the capital, as well as some other cities here in Montana, Helena and Great Falls and Butte and Anaconda and a few others thrown in there as well. But Bozeman really wanted the capital here in this place because, of course, with the capital brought all sorts of economic value, economic
government
bonuses.
Funding and all kinds of things. Yeah.
And we'd always been about trying, Bozeman was built with government funding.
Right. From Fort Ellis all the way through.
From Fort Parker, So it was built with government contracts. So we knew that business pretty well. And so we knew that having the capital here would be really important. So they were building a lot of brick buildings at that time and kind of beautifying Bozeman, making it look better and bigger and better and more wonderful. And so that's why this building was built.
That is just so funny that you say that. So they needed a really classy brothel. Is kind of what you're saying.
That's exactly what I'm saying. So they built a beautiful brick hotel, just right on,
the Bozeman
right in this
Hotel,
area,
right
the
up
Bozeman
on Rouse.
Hotel.
Okay.
Yep. And they were building a lot of brick buildings along Main Street, up, your building.
Where my shop is in, all the way over on Wilson and Main.
Yep,
okay.
Yep. They built that building. And so they were just trying to kind of make Bozeman look a little bit nicer, make it look a little more high class.
Yes.
And so this building was built at that time, and it was built by a man whose name was Joseph Lindley. And Joseph Lindley was a
Now, wait a
mover and
second.
shaker.
We all know Joseph Lindley because we know the name Lindley, because one of our biggest parks where we have our Sweet Pea Festival is Lindley Park.
Right.
Yeah, and there are streets with his name. So he's one of these so-called founding fathers.
Right.
All right, yeah, tell us a little bit more about that.
He was a real estate guy. He was into real estate. He was into buying and selling. And so he knew where the money was going to be made. And so he built this building, and it was a brick building. It still is a brick building. It's now covered with white stucco, so you don't see the brick on the outside, but it is a beautiful 2-story brick building.
Very solidly built.
Very solid, yes. So he had this built specifically to be a brothel, so that because he knew that that's what was needed if the capital was going to be coming here to Bozeman. So
that's so interesting. And is there a reason, and there's so many questions I want to ask, and one is there a reason he selected this location to build the building? I mean, we're one block off of Main Street.
Yeah.
At the east end, sort of town, or what would have been.
Kind of close to downtown.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Just one block off of downtown.
Yes.
So we are, he built this building specifically in this area because this was the red light district. So it had been established as the red light district in the 1880s. Late 1880s. And so this was the place where they were trying to really put all of the houses of ill repute. They were trying to kind of corner all these places into a very restricted district.
So if there was drinking or gambling or prostitution, it was occurring in this area. Mm-hmm. So this was sort of a legally designated area where everyone knew this is where this stuff is going on. And so it keeps it away from other parts
the neighborhoods. Right. And this was a national movement. So in the 1890s, late 1880s, 1890s, cities across the nation were doing this. They were really creating these districts of vice, or these red light districts is what we call them now.
Right.
But they were
I like districts of vice.
Districts of vice. Yes. I know it sounds very
right.
But they were putting all the vice, and I'm using air quotes now, all the vice into specific places that were close to downtown, but easily accessible from the train depot. So you could get off the train and get to them pretty easily, or they were right off of Main Street usually.
So it's a block off of Main Street, very accessible. And as we know, there is an elementary school just sort of diagonally across the main street from here. Was there a school there historically as well?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, but it was an important part of every town. It was a part of every town, which we don't have red light districts anymore. We have kind of the bad parts of town, but we don't have these places that were set up to contain the vice.
Right.
And they did that because the police liked this, because they kind of could manage vice a little bit easier. They also did it because the government could regulate these places a little easier as well. These saloons,
know where
these
stuff needs to happen, was going to happen. And I'm sure there were times where they periodically staged some kind of raids or something where that they could get whatever financial kickback for people who might have broken permits or didn't have the right permits they needed, whether it was selling alcohol or something.
Right.
But so there was a much more kind of regulated interaction then between the government and the police and those sort of open vice. So these things were sort of illegal, but not illegal.
Right. So the brothels, for example, were semi-legal. So there were ordinances in Bozeman and in other, in all cities throughout the nation, there was ordinances in place saying, these places were not legal, but the ordinances had fines attached to them. So you would be fined if you were in violation of this ordinance, but the fines weren't that large. So, for example, here in Montana, the fine for a madam for operating a house of prostitution was $10 a month. And so a madam could easily pay that. That wasn't
just
a hardship
the cost
at all.
of doing business.
Yeah.
Then. Okay.
And then for the ladies who lived in the houses, it was $5 a month.
Okay.
So you see lists in the newspapers here in Montana and through cities throughout the nation that, where they talk about all these women came in to pay their fines of $10 and $5 each month.
So it generates revenue for the city, but it's at a cost that could be supported by the people engaging in those businesses, shall we say, businesses of vice. And it seems to me also then if Lindley is building this house, that men are clearly, men of all status are visiting these areas and partaking. So they don't want these things to completely go away. They probably also want them to be nice places to visit.
Right.
So here he is building one, but I can't help but thinking what his wife thought about it and how she felt about it and what that conversation was like among the women.
Her name is on the deed.
Oh my goodness. So she clearly knew, or at least someone wanted it to appear that way.
Right.
Yeah. Well, how could she not know? It's such a small town. Yeah.
And it was a small town at that time. And so Joseph Lindley owned this jointly with his wife. Her name is on the deed right along with his. And she lived about 2 blocks on the other side of Main Street. So she lived on, the south side of town. And this was on the north side of town.
Okay.
And so she didn't live too far away. And I'm sure that the women who worked in this house knew her, and she probably knew who they were. I'm always curious what that interaction looked like, if there ever was an interaction. But there probably had to be some kind as you were walking down the street.
You can't completely avoid each other for over years and years of living in this small town. I mean, there's only so many places to get your groceries, get your food, run into people.
Right.
It is interesting. It seems like all the historic churches are on the south side. There's definitely a south side, north side divide in Bozeman.
There is a divide, and that's another reason they wanted to confine these places of vice to these restricted districts, is because that way, there wasn't houses of prostitution popping up in neighborhoods next to women like Rachel Lindley. She didn't want to. She probably was happy to get the proceeds from the revenue from this house. But of course, she didn't want a house of prostitution popping up next to her nice, beautiful house over on Lindley Street.
So the madam then, she actually rented this house.
Yeah, she did not
from
own it.
the Lindleys, and then later it was sold back to the Story family, or they took over. So tell us about the madam of this house, or what you know about the one who it was built for, or maybe she was even consulted on how to lay out the house and what it should look like and what should go in it. Yeah.
So Lindley owned this house for the first few years, and the woman who was the madam of this house, and what that basically means is she managed the house. Her name was Libby Hayes, and she was the madam of this house from probably around 1900 to 1910, 1912. And so, which is a really long time.
That's a long time
for someone
to be a
stay in one place, because usually these women would come and go. They would move around a lot because it was a semi-legal business. It wasn't completely legal. So sometimes the sheriff would come in and kind of push everyone out, and everyone would leave and go to Butte for, a few months, and then kind of make their way back to Bozeman. But Libby really stayed
here.
Not
a lot of job security or I mean, that must have been challenging for women of all sorts involved at all those levels. Yeah.
But the Libby's story is very interesting because she came here to Bozeman. She actually grew up in Kentucky and made her way west somehow. I don't really know how, but she shows up here in the late 1800s, late 1890s, early 1900s, not by herself, but with her two sisters, Hattie and Maddie. And so it was Hattie, Maddie, and Libby. And the three of them all worked in Bozeman's red light district. And Libby always worked in this house, but her two sisters kind of moved around a little bit into different houses.
Okay.
And in around 1908, 1909, or so, we see Maddie working up in Canada for a time, and then she comes back. And so it's an interesting family business in that way.
Right. These women must have needed a way to support themselves, and maybe they were able to help each other and support each other in this in that difficult business. So you said then this house was built in 1891, but she didn't take over until 1900.
Probably in 1900.
So this building had already
been here, but
the building had already been being used as a brothel, and so it was used as a brothel for quite a long time. Then, if she came in 9 years after it was built and was the madam for another 10 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
So the Hayes sisters story is kind of sad, though. Libby was here for those years. Hattie worked in a house just right, 3 houses down for many years. But Hattie died in 1908 of sepsis, which is an infection of the blood, probably from a venereal disease or from something that was a result of her work.
Sure.
And she died very young. She was only 29 years old.
Oh, goodness. Yeah.
So Hattie is buried in our local cemetery. And then Libby followed her not too many years later. In 1913, Libby died of uterine cancer.
Oh, goodness.
That's what it says on her death certificate.
And of course, you wonder if that had anything to do also with her line of work.
Right. Yeah. And so she's buried with Hattie in our local cemetery. And when Libby died, she was only 34 years old. So, this wasn't an easy life. No. And it was very hard. And it was, most women that we've researched who worked in this red light district died young.
Yes.
And died horrible deaths. So, either of drug overdose, or suicide, or dying from something like syphilis or other diseases that
really, really rough. And you said they're both in our cemetery here. Yeah.
So then you ask, what happened to the third sister?
Yes. What happened to her? So was she still in Canada, or was that the other one?
That was Maddie. Okay. She was in Canada, but she came back when Libby died, and she took over the property. So right before Libby died, she actually moved out of this house that we're in, and bought a house next door.
Oh, so she became a property owner.
Her own property owner.
Wow. And was it still a red light district at that point? Okay.
And so she had her own house. house, and she probably had women working for her in that house. And that was in 1912, and then she died in 1913.
Oh, gosh.
So,
but she had property then. What happened to that?
So Maddie came home and took over that property.
Okay.
And she worked out of that property until about 1918. And that's when all red light districts across the nation were shut down.
Okay. National story. So that's just the way of what everyone was doing.
Around World War I, the federal government really did a shutdown. And there was a lot of reform movements, a lot of movement in that direction for many years. And it finally just kind of shut everything down in 1918, 1920. So Maddie, who had been a prostitute her whole life, it's not like she had a lot of other job options to go into at this late stage. So she moved to Casper, Wyoming, and she was working as a crystal ball reader for a time.
Oh, goodness.
And so we see her in the newspaper advertising.
Fantastic. She reinvented herself.
She did. And then we see her working in restaurants kind of at the end of her life. And she died she was in her 90s when she died.
Wow.
And she died in Casper, and she died in, I think it was 1962.
Goodness, she lived a long time.
She lived
a lot of change.
A lot of change. So I had the opportunity. I was driving through Casper last summer, and so I stopped to see her grave. And it's actually an unmarked grave. And so she died with very little money. And so she didn't have enough money for a headstone. And so probably the end of her life was pretty rough because she didn't have any family left.
Family. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So.
But probably what she inherited then from Libby might have helped her through to at least have end. That life. Yeah. And is Libby one of the women who has a very large headstone in our cemetery? Her
and Hattie are buried together, and it's not a very large headstone, but it's a very beautiful headstone.
Nice. And they weren't segregated in a different part of the cemetery.
No.
That's interesting. So segregated in the red light district in life, but they were allowed to be buried in the cemetery where everyone else was.
Right.
Tell us a little bit before we wind down here, Crystal, if this story of red light districts in Bozeman, is this similar to other small towns or other, moderate-sized towns in Montana? I mean, we know Butte was sort of one of the bigger cities with the mining industry for a while. We have a lot of different places. Helena got the capital, Yeah. So what have you learned? I know. Right. What did you learn? Yeah, despite our lovely brothel, we did not get the capital, so it wasn't nice enough. It had to be a 4-story brothel.
Yeah, right.
So, what were the red light districts like in other Montana towns?
They were very similar to the red light district here in Bozeman. Most every town in Montana and through the West and through the nation really had a red light district during this time frame that I'm talking about, which is about the 1890s through the 1920s. And they all were located about a block off of Main Street, easily accessible by the train. They were often located right next to the the historic Chinese community.
Okay. Sure.
We think of these Chinatowns. We think of, Chinatown in San Francisco. We think of Chinatown in Butte. Those Chinatowns were located right next to
So often adjacent to the red light district.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these places where you would expect, but they're easily accessible from Main Street downtowns, from travelers getting off a train. So kind of almost a template for where to put the vice and, a community of people perceived as foreign, Yeah.
And in the bigger cities, these red light districts were often next to the theater district. So that
fascinating.
Kind of,
Sure.
Yep. In Bozeman, we really didn't have a theater district. But in Chicago and in New Orleans and stuff like that.
Sure, that idea of performance, being built into that as well.
So these, it was part of our history. And of course, prostitution never went away. Prostitution, after they shut down the red light districts, prostitution just went into different places. And oftentimes it went into the back rooms of saloons, into these places called assignation houses where you could rent a room for an hour. And so looking at it through historically, and looking at this house that we work out of now, this would have been a nice place for women to live and for women to work.
Would have been a nicer setting to have to do that work. Yeah. And how interesting that Libby then came to even own one of that possibility even exists. Very different when we think of later prostitution, when you think of women being on a street corner and then having a male, a pimp, basically governing over her rather than a madam or a woman who is operating a house. Yeah. Very different work conditions.
Very different, and here in Bozeman, there weren't any pimps, male pimps. It was women were the pimps, it was the same thing. Women were still pimping out younger women.
Right.
But it was women who were doing that. But in Butte, there were they called them secretaries. And so instead of pimps, they called these men secretaries.
Interesting.
And so there were some male secretaries in Butte and other places, in larger places. But in the smaller towns, women, in the West, women kind of ran things themselves, it seems like.
Yeah. Fascinating. And I'm sure just how this fits into just those bigger pictures of, what do I want to say, sort of businesses of vice and just red light districts, or just in general, how that compares with what was going on in coastal cities and other parts of the country, given that you see these big, broad, sweeping national movements where first you're putting them all in a red light district and then you're cracking down and getting rid of those again. And then the long-standing implications for people who end up in those lines of work for whatever reasons. Yeah. Well, fascinating. And I know Libby Hayes will always live on in history because we will always be here to tell her story and have it be a part of this house that you're working out of. And that's fascinating. And it is a beautiful space to this day. So I hope that it was at least a nice place to spend time for the women who had to work out of here.
Right.
I'm sure it was never their first choice of how their life would have ended up.
No, I don't think so.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think it was. I think it was not a choice, but it was something that they kind of ended up doing because they had to make a living. They had to support themselves. They had to support their children and maybe even support extended families. So,
and a lot of them out west had no family support. They ended up on their own, even if they came maybe with someone or for someone, and then that didn't work out. So, so these stories just, it's wonderful. It's a little known, lesser known story, but such an important part of understanding communities in the West. Right. So is there anything else we want to touch on before we wind down today's episode?
I think that's about it. Yeah, I think that we covered a few things and we have some more interesting interviews coming up in the next few weeks. So make sure to keep listening. And it is Women's History Month. And so go out there and learn something about the women in your life. Go out and learn something about your grandmother, your mother, your aunt, your best friend's mother.
I guarantee you'll find something out that you didn't know.
Stories.
Yeah. Next week we are going to talk with Jen Zuha, who has been a librarian who really helps people with their research. This amazing research things that she gets involved in because she's assisting people and she's had a fascinating life herself. So she's going to be on with us on the Dirt on the Past next week. And we just wanted to say to anyone listening, if you have other ideas of people that you might like to hear us interview, work that they do that you think is fascinating but maybe hasn't gotten out there, go ahead and shoot us an email to info@theextremehistoryproject.org. Do we have the or
no,
just extreme? Okay, so let me say that again. If you have an idea, go ahead and shoot us an email to info@extremehistoryproject.org. And that's all one word. So info@extremehistoryproject.org. And we would be happy to hear some ideas about, again, people or research that you think we might like to talk about on the Dirt on the Past. So we just want to thank everyone out there for listening. And if you can leave us a review, that really helps people find us. And make sure to pass this podcast on to your friends and family. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope you can join us again to find out more about the Dirt on the Past.
If you're enjoying The Dirt on the Past, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Also, please tell your friends and leave us a review. It really helps people find us. We are a new podcast and we are trying to grow our listener base. So please share. Thanks, and thanks for listening. You've been listening to The Dirt on the Past, a podcast of the Extreme History Project and Gallatin Valley Community Radio, KGVM. To hear more episodes, visit our website at theextremehistoryproject.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep searching out the dirt on the past.